Let's talk about what to do if you have an orchid with lots of healthy roots, but the leaves have all dropped and died. That can be a really big problem. First, let's talk about what causes leaves to drop. So there's three main culprits. The first could be temperature. There's some orchids that are really sensitive to cold temperatures. So one orchid that comes to mind is the Dendrobium nobile. If it gets too cold, the leaves turn yellow and they drop. Another reason is poor nutrition. So one thing you can do to prevent this is just make sure that you properly feed your orchid when it's actively growing. When you see new roots and new leaves coming, that's an important time to really properly feed and water your orchid. That's when it's hungriest and most thirsty, when it's actively growing. Another reason that your orchid could lose all of its leaves is lack of water. So if you notice that that's a problem in the past, then you can just make up for it in the future with new orchids that you make sure get enough water without drowning in water. Most orchids, especially if they don't have pseudobulbs like a Phalaenopsis or a Paphiopedilum, those types of orchids like their potting mix to be damp but never soggy. Other orchids that have pseudobulbs like Cattleyas, Dendrobiums, Oncidiums, they might like to dry out a little bit between watering. Or another reason, this is an example, so I have this stem right here, and if it starts to rot, then the leaves will separate and they will fall off. So those are a couple of causes, but let's talk about what we can do if we find ourselves in that situation where the leaves have all fallen off, but you still have some really nice healthy roots. So one thing that you can do is to create sort of an orchid hospital. So you'll take your orchid. So imagine that this orchid doesn't have any leaves, right? And what you can do is you can cover it with a clear plastic bag. So say like you have a dry cleaner's bag, something like that, a big clear plastic bag, and you can kind of tent it over the top, and that will create kind of a greenhouse. But there's a couple of things you need to watch out for. You need to make sure that it's not getting too hot in the little greenhouse. So you want to put it in kind of a shaded area, and you want it to be kind of cool because the heat will build up inside the greenhouse, and you'll want to check it to make sure that you don't get any mold growing because you're not going to get a lot of air movement. Now, I'm going to tell you something very special about Phalaenopsis orchids. So Phalaenopsis orchids are what we call monopodial. That means that they have one stem right here. Okay, this is their single stem. The single stem has something in it called an apical meristem. And the apical meristem is kind of like the brain for the orchid, and it will tell it what to do. Depending on the conditions, the apical meristem will trigger a leaf, a root, or a flower stalk. So if you don't have any leaves, right, then what you would want to do is to trigger leaf growth. The way to do that is to put it in a nice shady location where it can kind of heal, and you want to have high humidity. One way of doing that is to have the little greenhouse tent, or you can place it on a container. Let me show you. So here is a simple humidity tray that I've created, and I just have a container right here. Inside is some gravel, and then on top of the gravel is some egg crate. So this can have water that sits on it, and then the orchid will sit on top, and it just increases the humidity around the orchid. So the three main things that you can do are, number one, make sure that you water your orchid properly. Don't overwater it, don't underwater it. It's a sweet spot where you want, if we're talking about the Phalaenopsis again, then you just want the potting media to be just barely damp. And the other thing that you can do is to maintain proper humidity. And if you have high humidity, then air movement is always really good to help prevent disease. And then lastly, you'll need to have a lot of patience and time. And if you are very fortunate, then new leaves will begin to grow. Even if your orchid never recovers and grows new leaves, all is not lost. You've still learned a lot. You've learned that it's really important to maintain temperature with just a 10 to 15 degree temperature drop at night. You've also learned that it's really important to water your orchid properly and to feed it, especially when it's actively growing, and not over or under water your orchid. I always say that is definitely worth a try, and especially if you have nice green roots, then where there is green, there is hope. Again, you don't want the roots to always stay green because that's the color that they are when they're wet. But if you see green on your orchid, there is still life. If you found this video helpful, subscribe, watch more videos, go to orchidbliss.com where my website is, and you are also more than welcome to join the community Orchid Buds, where we grow orchids together. We have members-only events, classes, and personalized help.